So if there is this trade-off between the unemployment rate and inflation, then the question that at least came up after Phillips first drew his curve was whether or not central banks could choose a point along the Phillips curve that best fit their preferences. And so what we're going to look at then is what these preferences might look at for the central bank. And then we're going to see that the role of expectations was important in showing central banks that they really couldn't choose any point along the Phillips curve. And this is really what led to the breakdown of the Phillips curve relationship in the 1970s and 1980s. So if we think about central banks, they don't want too much unemployment, right? And so unemployment, remember, is increasing to the left. And they don't want too much inflation, and they don't want deflation, right? And so we can think of their policy preferences as like a bullseye around some target point of the unemployment rate and inflation, where they're willing to trade off some inflation for lower unemployment and vice versa, but really they would like to be at some point, labeled X here as the best outcome. And then the question is, well, can they get to that best outcome? And right now what we see in this graph is that X is at 2% inflation. And that's basically where most central banks try to keep inflation, is somewhere around 2%. And then there is some debate from economists that say that 3 or 4% inflation might be better, and we'll talk about why that is. So if central banks have this sort of bullseye type indifference curves, then the question is, well, can they achieve them? And what we see is that they maybe what they can do is, choose some point along the Phillips curve that gives them some trade-off between the unemployment rate and inflation. So, for instance, this point here where the policymakers' indifference curves are just tangent to the Phillips curve is where the unemployment rate is equal to 3% and inflation is equal to 5%. And so that's what it kind of looked like in the 1950s was, hey, the unemployment rate is 6%, but we have no inflation, but maybe we can goose it up to 5% inflation and reduce the unemployment rate to 3%, right? Because we would like to get the unemployment rate lower. And that seemed like a reasonable thing to think at the time. Unfortunately, it really didn't work out. And so what we're going to want to see here is, why didn't it work out? And so this graph shows the unemployment rate and inflation going from the 1960s in blue all the way through the late 90s and 2000s and early 2010s in purple. And you can see that the 1960s, we had this, what looked like a fairly stable Phillips curve, although it was sort of somewhat shifted up from the original Phillips curve. In the 1970s, it seemed to shift up even more. In the late 1970s, it kind of started falling apart, and then in the 1980s, it really had fallen apart completely. And it looked like there was no relationship between the unemployment rate and inflation. And the key here is that there's only one unemployment rate at which inflation is stable, and that's going to be the unemployment rate where the wage curve crosses the profit curve. And trying to keep the unemployment rate at some level less than that is just going to lead to inflation, and then higher inflation, and then higher inflation because of the expectations of both firms and workers. So how do those expectations work? Well, what we're going to see is that if you try to move the unemployment rate to the right, so a lower unemployment rate, you open up a bargaining gap, right? And we said, hey, the bargaining gap means that we have higher inflation. And if we have higher inflation, then people are going to start expecting higher inflation. So imagine that you are a firm and inflation has been 3% for the last couple of years. Well, you're going to start expecting 3%. That means that you'll be willing to give your workers a 3% raise, and it means that you're going to raise your prices by 3% as well. And If that happens, then we might end up with 5% inflation and then 7% inflation. We'll walk through that. But you can see that the only way we can get sort of back to inflation stabilizing rate of unemployment is where the wage curve crosses the profit curve. So let's think about where we are. So if we're at point A, right, on our Phillips curve, where inflation is 3% and the profit curve is crossing the wage curve, then we would expect inflation to stay at 3%. But if we move up to point B, now we have a bargaining gap of 2%. Now, in order to keep workers working efficiently, we need to give them their expected inflation of 3% plus a 2% raise, which is 5%. Well, if that's the case, if we raise wages by 5%, then prices are going to go up by 5%, meaning that the real wage that workers are paid is lower than they expected. And so now we have 5% inflation, and next year we're going to have to raise their wages even more, assuming the bargaining gap stays the same. And this is the problem of trying to keep the unemployment rate too low, is that wages keep going up and up and up. The only place where they're stable is at where the wage curve crosses the profit curve. So we can see a couple examples. So in this first example where we have stable inflation, we have 3% expected inflation. That means wages go up by 3%, prices go up by 3% every year. The unemployment rate is the rate at which the wage curve crosses the profit curve, or 6%, and there's no bargaining gap. And so we end up with just 3% inflation each year. Everybody's getting what they expected in terms of profits and real wages. What about with rising inflation? Well, if inflation was 3% and we try to move the unemployment rate to 3%, that opens up a bargaining gap of 2%. Well, that means that actual inflation is going to be the 3% that we expected plus the 2% due to the bargaining gap, or 5%. Well, now workers are disappointed, firms are disappointed, and now we have 5% inflation. Well, if we expect inflation to be the same as it was last year, what are called adaptive expectations, now we have 5% inflation plus that same 2% bargaining gap because the unemployment rate is still 3%, which means we end up with 7% inflation. And again, firms and workers are disappointed. And because of that, the next year, now we have 7% inflation plus the 2% bargaining gap, we get 9% inflation. And so inflation is going up and up and up because we're trying to keep the unemployment rate lower than we should. So this is really important for a central bank. This is something they didn't realize in the 50s and 60s, but by the 70s they had definitely realized it. Sort of economists started writing about this in the sort of middle to late 60s. And so central banks since then have been really targeting an area where they think the unemployment rate won't put any pressure on inflation. All right, so how can we think about this then with inflation expectations and the Phillips curve? This is sometimes called the inflation expectations-augmented Phillips curve. And basically what is going on is simply that this wage curve is, the Phillips curve, is shifting up because of these higher inflationary expectations. And that means that, instead of staying at B, we move to C, and then we would move up again, and we would move up again. And so the only way to decrease expected inflation is to bring inflation down. And the only way to bring inflation down in this model is to increase unemployment. And that was very similar to what was going on in the 1970s, was that we were trying to keep the unemployment rate low, perhaps lower than it should have been. It's possible that the unemployment rate was higher then because the baby boomers were lower. And because of that, the inflation rate was going higher and higher, although there was another reason too, which we're going to talk about next, which was an increase in the price of oil.